we're going to talk about the pivot, which I'm going to say the podcast might have been a little bit of a pivot for the two of us.
Right.
It took us out of our box and we tried something different, and it doesn't perfectly align with what we're doing, but it's kind of a little detour
Right.
or something. I don't know. So what do you think?
Well, I think a good indicator of a pivot in work world or reaction of others. One thing I've noticed is when I post on LinkedIn or podcasts or similar material, I have a lot of people that look at my profile because they're wondering, what the heck is she doing? Which is an indication of a pivot, right? It's a change
Right.
that people are like, oh, this is different than what we're used to. So I would agree to the pivot, and
Yeah.
it's being supported by those in LinkedIn.
Right. Right. So one of the things that we talked about, like, how do you successfully pivot? And I found an article, of course, you know me, I'm always looking for information. And it had 5 steps to perfecting the pivot.
Okay.
I was like, okay, so some of them I knew, some of them, like one of them is to create a plan. And then, one of them is to implement the plan. So those were pretty basic. The very first one, though, was to tell yourself it's okay, which here's the sentence that caught or the two sentences that caught my attention. This will require you to get rid of the sunk cost fallacy you might have.
Man, we
Understand
talk
that.
about that a lot. That's
I
a
know,
great point.
right? Every moment, dollar, ounce of effort you spent before will never be recovered, and that you must draw a line in the sand.
So true.
I know. And I thought about pivots that I've done, but I also thought about your pivot. Like when you left the executive life, that was a huge pivot for you. And I think of all of the stuff that you had invested, all the time, all the energy that you had invested in getting to that point in your life. And then
Do you
you
want to know
spent
something
that.
interesting about that, Amy? Now that you bring that up, this is so funny because we both come into this cold, just for the listeners, with
Yes.
our main ideas. And, what comes from the other always provokes more thought, which is wonderful and why we're doing this with everyone. But what's interesting about that, do you know that I had the easiest time with the sunk costs, but the close people around me had a very hard time with it? Okay. So, like, I'm going to give you a quick example. So I left the executive life, the CPA, and I didn't want my CPA license anymore. It didn't matter to me. I'm like, why would I use it? In fact, I saw it as a liability because I thought I could never break myself from constantly being seen as only a financial advisor. My dad about had a heart attack. He said, "You worked so hard for that. You cannot." And he was very animate about that. He wasn't the only one. They thought I was out of my mind. And I would tell you that I went with the in between. It is, it's inactive. So I don't do the 40, 50 hours of tax because I don't want to do that kind of work. But that's an example. And another one was I had worked so much in healthcare. I had people, my close people around me, my mentors, and they said, this is what you do. You can't give this up. You need to lead with finance. Amy, they had a harder time than I did. And the point in all that is, even if you can get past the sunk costs, it's a hard human thing for people to do in general. So you have another layer of complexity because most people probably aren't going to understand that sunk cost mentality is not just you. You're going to have the peer pressure of those around you telling you not to do it because that's the mentality they have.
Right. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge, because when you decide to pivot in your mind, you're already gone. You've made that decision, and then the fear is starting to tell people and what the feedback is going to be on it, and how do you handle that feedback, and who's supporting you, who's not supporting you. So that's and if you're going to be strong enough to do it, knowing that you're getting all this feedback, like, because that's when some people probably take a step back and start doubting what they're doing.
Right. Right. And it's easy to doubt what you're doing. And there is there's this whole thing wrapped around change that humans innately have a fear of. It's
Mhm.
just no matter what it is. If change is all those quotes out there, change is hard,
Right.
change is tough, it's courageous to change because it's so comfortable to continue to do the same thing. And there, it's the fear of the unknown. So pivoting, when it's done, the interesting thing about pivoting, and I actually, I like to look things up in the dictionary because I thought I could feel myself um, interchanging the words change with pivoting, and they're very different. And the dictionary tends to be very concise. And pivot as a verb is to turn on, or as on a pivot. He swung around, pivoting on his heels. So it's a very material change. So a pivot is a very abrupt, visible change. And although change happens, a pivot is big. It's
Right. It is big. It's
and
not like a little detour of, oh, I'm going this way, but I'll be back. I'm making a big change.
And isn't it interesting that I I believe a majority of the time as people are pivoting, they really are being courageous because it's not uh, supported overall, because of the fear of those around them. But once people successfully pivot, there is a huge uh, uh, admiration and accolades given to that person who pivoted. So it is a
Yeah.
courageous move to perfect the pivot when it is an intentional choice, right? Because sometimes we
Right.
pivot
Right.
just like this year, 2020 COVID, when it's not. So,
Right. Right. You're right. I think the intentionality and the choosing to pivot versus being forced to pivot are two different things.
mhm,
Yeah. But I would say people who are forced to pivot and handle it well still get that admiration from others
right, right.
of they handled the change. Look at how well they're doing. Their survival. There's a lot of respect for stuff like that. So anyway. All right. The second point of this article was create relationships with people in the area you are pivoting to.
Oh, that's very good.
I know. I thought that was interesting. I never did that when I was doing my pivots, like even doing this podcast, this little pivot, which I'm going to say was probably more of a detour than a big life changing pivot.
Right,
but
right.
but this, like, I didn't connect with other podcasters initially. I think I talked to one just to kind of see the logistics of it. But when my big pivot was probably quitting work and deciding to stay home with my kids, because that was a 180 from what that was. We've talked about that before when we talked about the life script model. But so that was my big pivot. And I remember being in that moment and staying home and not knowing what to do with myself and not having any role models of, my daughter was keeping me busy, but there were times that I didn't have stuff. And I was like, I didn't create a community before I pivoted to that. And there were some struggles and challenges because I was used to working and I was trying to find my value and trying to find, there was a lot of self growth that had to happen during that time.
From a work standpoint, the example I give that I find this advice very helpful is when I did pivot, it was both getting around. I did find other people in the community. I became a strengths coach, so there were friends there that I got advice from. We talked about what they were doing with that. Other people that I admired. Back with the speaking, I joined a group called Speaking Sisters and got a lot of feedback. And that's actually where Jess came from. The book we're going to read soon was from the Speaking Sisters. But the flip side to that too, Amy, because you can only have so many relationships, is I tried to separate myself from being a huge part of the community that I was pivoting from. Okay. So every
Oh,
banker
yes.
that wanted to have a lunch, everybody wanted to, all this whole network I created, which is hard because back to sunk costs, I had
Right.
this huge network around people that gave me finance work, but there's only so many hours in the day. And I always emphasize time. So I had to really be picky about foster nurturing those relationships and finding new ones to nurture. And a big help for me is when I moved, because I'm very careful in how I identify, and I have plenty of finance work. I don't need any more finance work. So I'm very careful about who I tell, what I do when I meet new people. And I've been able to create a different type of community. And that's been very helpful. But you don't always have the benefit of moving when you pivot, right?
Right. I can see where a move though would be a real line in the sand. This is where the line is.
It
And
takes away the peer pressure from the others giving advice because you're able to start fresh. So that
right,
sunk cost kind of goes away.
right,
So it is a point, maybe you don't have to move where you live, but a piece of advice I would add to that is, yes, you need to add a new community, but if you mentally make a move or a change to moving into a new space, it will help you mentally segregate what you're pivoting from and what you're pivoting to, so you're more intentional about it.
right. Yes. Yeah, it would be very hard to, if you want to pivot to another career and you're still in your current career and you don't have the ability to just leave it.
Right.
Having that current career and the demands of that and trying to build, I see that a lot with people who want to start businesses. They keep their current 9 to 5
Right.
and then they're trying to build their business in the evenings and weekends and over lunch, and there's a lot of restraints around that because you're not fully pivoting. You're giving just a little bit of effort to it, just what you have time for. You
Yep.
just can't give it 100%. So that makes a big difference. Yeah.
Yep. Ton of sense.
All right. So number 3 and number 4 were pretty basic on this list because number 3 was just to create a plan, have your goals, have the SMART goals. Number 4 was implement. But number 5 was don't burn bridges. And did you burn bridges when you left? You probably didn't because you're a relationship builder.
I didn't, but I actually have this written down on my sheet of paper right now that has nothing to do with us, but I'm making a change right now with a client relationship. And when we did our advice episode, this one stuck with me. Don't run from a job, walk to a new one.
Yeah.
Okay. And because sometimes that's burning bridges. If you're running from that job, I did okay. I had a nice jog going on and I wasn't burning bridges. I could say I wasn't burning bridges, but I had made up my mind and the whole transition, I did it. It was a little bit painful because I didn't want to be there in either case. So no, great advice not to burn bridges. I would say I probably didn't. But I probably would have been a little bit better about it and taken another word I'd use or a phrase I'd use is take control of your situation in a positive way. So don't burn bridges, don't run from what you're pivoting from, but you be in charge. You take the lead. You can't do that if you're running away. You can't do that if you're burning bridges because there's no collaboration. So take control of your pivot in a very thoughtful way.
Yeah. I think that's a great, and I would say, I don't know that I've ever burnt bridges, but I would say for a visual instead of burning, I definitely put gates down and put boundaries around those bridges.
Right.
These are I'm not spending time on these relationships anymore. I'm just not going to nurture that piece anymore. And like I remember one job I quit and I apparently left some stuff on my desk. I don't remember, but like a month later, and this was when I had transitioned to another job. And so a month or so later, one of my colleagues had stuck the stuff in my door. Like he stopped by, put the stuff in the door. He didn't even say hi or anything. But
Wow.
he sent me a little note and said, or it wrote a note and said, I just wanted to drop this stuff off to you. And I was like, okay, he didn't even reach out. So I was like, I must have like really put a bridge or
Yeah.
a blockade on that.
Or the
That's
bridge that goes like this, right?
yeah, the drawbridge.
Drawbridge.
The bridge is up.
We have lots of visuals going on here, the drawbridge.
Right. So, which, the visual of the drawbridge is great though, because it's up, but it's not, the bridge isn't gone. So, I do feel like I could reach out to those people, although it's been 20 plus years and they may not know who I am anymore, but the bridge only went up. I could bring it back down if I wanted to.
Right, right, right. Interesting. So what was
Yeah.
number 5 on that list?
That was number 5 was don't burn bridges.
Number
Yeah.
5.
Oh, number 4, I didn't talk about number 4. Number 4 is implementing the plan, taking action, working on the transition, and don't look back.
Because my big thing that I came into this for, and I don't know if it fits in any of these categories, or we have to go back to the title of the the pivot, what they're achieving with the 5. But my big thing, back to change versus pivot, is the better you are in intentionally grasping change. What's the word I want to use? The better you are at adapting and embracing change daily, and even putting it, inserting it in your life, the better able you are to pivot, because you're really training yourself for that. And
Yeah.
again, most pivots, even if they're intentional or unintentional, it is a big change. And I would tell you that the more you're ready for, the more you make small changes and accept those and try different things, the better you are at the pivot. And I'll give the example I'd give is, this is just a simple one. Let's just talk about running. Okay. Let's say that you walked every day, you did the exact same pace, the exact same time, the exact same route. And all of a sudden one day, for whatever reason, you need to run, you have on your calendar, you have to run a 10K. Well, that's a pivot. It's a big change from what you're doing. And there's this mental block of, I don't know how to run. I've never done that. I haven't gone that far before, all these mental blocks. But if you walk every day and you change your route, you change it up and you run on occasion and see what a mile feels like. You do interval training, you do different types of things. When that 10K comes up, it doesn't seem so daunting. And that happens in life with jobs, with relationships, and your mind tells you what you can't do because you're so used to being good at what you do day in and day out, which is probably why people don't like change. You feel pretty darn successful when you do the same thing over and over again, right? And that mindset of change prepares you for any pivot that comes, whether it's 2020 COVID, or I've just, something happened or triggered me to believe that there's a change, a pivot I want to make in my life, work, relationship, surroundings, health. It's embracing change. It's embracing change as an intentional daily action is what I would say. And having that mindset.
Right. And it's interesting to me how different people approach change, and how um, I'm trying to think of. So my husband, here's a perfect example. He was raised in St. Louis. All of his family lived within, on both sides, cousins, grandparents, all lived within a 5-mile radius.
Mhm.
When we got married, we were trying to decide where to live, and I got a job in Kansas City. And so he had a job in St. Louis, and he decided he could transfer to Kansas City. He could find a job there. He was like, I think so, but that change in moving to St. Louis was so out of, or moving out of St. Louis was so out of the box for their family that it was really because he was the first grandkid to move away. And
Right.
so it was like, oh my gosh, what's happening? Like there was just so much um that was really huge. And then,
Parents
you
moving to
know,
Arizona, same thing. Yep.
exactly. And then to follow up when we moved to Omaha, for him, he had this thought that we had settled in Kansas City, we were going to be there forever. So when I brought up the subject of let's move to Omaha, he was like, because he was working up here. That's the whole reason. Like he was up here all the time. It's not like I just pulled it out of the hat and said, let's move. He was spending 3 weeks out of the month in Omaha. And so I was like, well, why am I living in Kansas City when you're in Omaha all the time? But that piece, again, it took me about a year and a half to persuade him that it's we're okay, we can move. You know, so it's interesting to me that, and I will say, and we're going to take a break here in a moment, but I just want to say that I think the amount of change that we're open to uh, makes our children more able to change, because I just think his parents role modeled, which there's nothing wrong with that, but they role modeled, you settle down, you stay in your house, you're with your family and those relationships, and that's where their comfort zone was. And so he had to learn that I'm more of a let's go, let's move.
Right.
And I think my kids are more like me because we've moved around a little.
But Tom was then, he was uh open to change. That was something new to him. It's back to, and because of that, it wasn't something he definitely had the sunk cost mentality, because that was ingrained in
Right.
him, right? So
Right.
that's a perfect example of somebody perfecting the pivot by being open-minded to change and intentional about saying, okay, I can do this. And whether it was baby steps that he did, but it was a mindset going into it. And I'm sure with Tom, there's no way that that mindset just happened that day. It had to be an evolution of a mindset, maybe with each pivot you made, right?
Right.
Um, but it's definitely an intentionality and an openness to change.
Right. And it's the very first one. Tell yourself it's okay. Like I'm going to say that's probably the very first hurdle.
Mhm.
Okay. So this, like getting through change. So here's the question for you. Have you always been comfortable with change?
Hell no. I was like Tom. I was like Tom.
Were
And
you?
through our podcast, I tell you, I was oh, I was going to get married, be fair, come home all the time, not be I didn't have to live close to home, but I was going to work for the same company, draw the pension, raise the kids. Oh, I was going to be on the foundation board for the colleges that they all went to, that I mean, I had the whole thing. So I tell you, my parents doing their leap of faith, because
Mhm.
nobody would have seen my parents moving from Remsen to Arizona. I mean, talk about sunk costs. They were two Toms and his parents. Both of their parents, I grew up with grandparents that I walked up the street or rode my bike, two sets of grandparents, extended family, farm. I mean, everybody was there. But I would tell you, my parents were the first um, teachers of me, and I actually didn't embrace it, Amy. So back to hell no. So I
Yeah.
did duplicate what they did in Remsen and Omaha. I did the same thing, got my job, worked the channels. And for me, it was the divorce that I didn't see coming and was not part of my plan. And I did not want it. I had a full plan. Um, yes, I could be adaptable if small things happened with clients or kids where I could be resourceful, but it was to get back on track with my plan.
Right, right,
It wasn't
right.
necessarily to change. So,
It wasn't to pivot. It was just to get back on your plan.
and I tell you how I got, because I've pivoted in many ways
Yeah.
since then. It was the self-awareness and reflection of what happened with that life event, which was not a pivot that I anticipated, that help me do your number one, which is it's okay.
Yeah.
That it's okay. I'm with you. That's probably the number one. And I, yeah, I'm very much open-minded to change. I intentionally do it. I try to shake things up, but I think it was going through an unanticipated pivot and learning from that and accepting that that's okay.
Yeah.
But no, I really was pretty bad at it, Amy. So
Yeah. So I was thinking about this question, and um, I I remember as a kid rearranging my bedroom probably like every other week. I would move my furniture around. So
Amy, I never move my furniture. I'm one of those people that I put it exactly the way I want it, and I never move my furniture. That is so funny.
so that is, but see, I like to change. And but I think just doing that, it's funny because I think about it and I meet people just like you. I don't move furniture, it stays. What are you doing? But I like change. And because here's what I have learned: you can change things, but you can go back. Like almost everything, you
Right,
can reverse it if you want to.
right.
We were talking about this with my mom, and she was talking about, conversations always come back to our parents, but my mom, she was talking about wanting to move somewhere. And we were talking about, okay, you don't have to say, I'm going to move forever. You can just say, I'm going to try this for a couple of years. I
Right,
can come back.
right.
If I don't like it, I can change. It doesn't mean it's a lifelong commitment. So I just changed offices. I moved from upstairs to downstairs, and I have a nice, quiet office now
It's
with,
beautiful.
it's lovely. I just love the peace and quiet. But um, it was, I'm just like, I'm gonna change and just see what happens. And if I like it, it's great. And it's funny because my husband was down here before a few years back, and he didn't like it down here. And he said it's cold. He's like, you're not gonna like it. And I said, well, I'm gonna try it. And if I don't like it, I'll move back. so, so anyway, I
I love it.
love change. But part of that I would say is I've had lots of practice. The other piece is I feel like there's a security net of if it goes wrong, what's the worst that can happen? And so
Love that.
anyway, I like change. And I think I like change so much that it drives people crazy, especially my husband. He's like, what are you doing?
So, yeah. Garrett's all for change, like moving, but I it isn't that he doesn't like moving the furniture. He doesn't see any real value in that. Like it doesn't do much for him. It has to be a reason. He likes to try different things, that's for sure.
Yeah, yeah,
My kids are perfectly fine with it. They're good. They're good change people.
yeah,
They're fine.
yeah. Mine are too, I think, for the most part. Yeah.
Amy, can I say one more thing about the pivot? The 2020, so 2020 with COVID,
Hmm.
everybody pivoted, whether they wanted to or not. I mean, everybody had to pivot. And so back to perfecting the pivot, there was a strand of conversation that happened around that pivoting. Um, a client of mine and I we were talking about businesses that will make it and businesses that won't. And his comment was, you know what, those that were strong going into it are going to come out perfectly fine. Those that weren't aren't going to make it. And it might be because they really were thinking about not keeping their business. They weren't in order. And I compared that. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I compared that when one of our hot tub board meetings with Garrett, I said, it's the same thing with relationships. If those relationships that were strong going into COVID are going to come out even stronger, and those that weren't aren't going to make it. Same thing. So
Yeah.
a great point, whether you want to pivot or not, if you're going to perfect it, you need to be in a good place when that pivot happens. It's back to, so if you're going to plan a pivot, you really need to have a strong base and get to that point where you tell yourself it's okay, know where you're at, your strengths and weaknesses, to move on. And I think 2020 is a great example of that.
I like what you said there because when you think about a pivot, it takes a lot of time, energy, planning, and stress and anxiety, possibly about a pivot, a big pivot. So having everything else be stable is probably pretty important. So, you don't want to have a pivot when you're having a move in your life and you have a bad relationship and you're pivoting to a different job. Like there, like that could be setting yourself up for not feeling successful in three different wheelhouses.
Right.
So if
Get
you
your house
just
in order.
yeah, get your house in order, right? Before you
Whether
do
your
that,
house is your physical house or
right?
your business house, but get your house in order.
Right. Before you figure out before you move to your pivot. That is a really good tip. Kudos. I like that. I'm sitting here, it's spinning in my head. I was like, woohoo. All right. So what's the real and what's the ideal in this?
That's a great one because I think the pivot is a perfect example of real and ideal, because the real is, wow, use 2020. It happens, and that's a great example of it being real, that pivots happen, right? That
Right.
big change happens. But the ideal is, a lot of everybody has an opportunity every day to rethink what they want their life to look like, and everybody has the opportunity and free will to intentionally make a pivot, and there's great benefits that come from that.
Right. Right. So that free will, if the pivot is not externally forced, like 2020 was an externally forced pivot. We were forced to pivot because of what's happening in the world. But if it's something that you're contemplating doing just for yourself, so you're going to pivot to a new job, you're going to whatever kind of pivot you're doing, that free will, I
Mhm.
think it's okay. Tell yourself it's okay. You can go either direction. It's okay. There's nothing forcing you to pivot. There's nothing forcing you not to pivot. That's the real in this situation, is if it's not external, it's up to you. And so that's the real. The ideal is to, along with what you were saying, is be open to the opportunities, because I think there's lots of opportunities out there. And if you are not pivoting and taking advantage of them, then you could be missing out on a better a better situation.
And follow your gut in which way you're going to go, because your gut's
Right.
usually right. But then have a plan. The gut is
Right.
so,
Right.
but then have a plan and execute.
Right.
If
Right.
your gut keeps telling you, and it's 3 years later, this is something I've wanted to do, explore it. At least explore it.
Yeah. At least explore it. Very good. All right. So wrap question. Um, so how's 2021 feeling for you?
You know, we're coming right off of the Capitol riots. We're 2 days
Right.
ago.
What is it? It's January 8th today. So
January.
our recording day is January 8th.
I still have my flag up. United we stand. Let's just, I believe, again, I don't want to get political, but, you can't put your head in the sand either. Um, let's just say I'm hopeful, and it's one day at a time. And I think every person needs to be intentional in their beliefs and their values. And how's it feeling? It's feeling like, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. And I think people had this misconception that the calendar was going to turn, it was going to be easy, but it's not. And so it's one day at a time. And I will tell you, last night, the positive is, how is 2021 feeling? We did a Zoom birthday call for my dad, which we've never done a Zoom call with just my immediate family, which was fun. And the second thing is that I am the new secretary for the Chamber Diplomats, the Chamber of Commerce Diplomats, which will mean
Oh,
I'll
nice.
actually be president, and I'll be on the board. I'll have a part on the board of the main chamber here. But one of the young gals, when we did our Zoom call last night, she's running for city council. So I thought of you, Amy, and I'm thinking I want to talk to her. And if I can see what her initiatives are and support her, that's a positive thing. So 2021 is going to, Amy, I'm feeling positive, optimism. How about you?
Good. I like that. So I'm just gonna say on Monday, Tuesday, what's today? Friday. So Monday, Tuesday, I was like thinking, okay, we had celebrated this new year and it still feels like 2020. Like I was just like, it still feels like 2020. Nothing has changed. We flipped the calendar, but nothing has really changed. There was a little bit of optimism and hope, but really and seriously, January feels just like December did. November, it feels the same. So I was a little like, eh. And then January 6th happened with the attack on the Capitol, and I was like, all right, this is I'm not happy about this. Like this is not where we need to be. We need to be moving out of this. And then my husband sent me a meme yesterday and it just was like, yep, there we are. I'm going to pull it up really quick so I
Good.
can say it exactly. It said, I'd like to cancel my subscription to 2021. I've experienced the 7-day free trial and I'm not interested.
That is hilarious.
I know. I was like, oh yeah, that's exactly how I feel today. I want to do New Year's again and like get a fresh start. Maybe that could come with February 1st.
And this, and I know we're running out of time, but remember 2020? And it was kind of the opposite. We thought something horrible was going to happen when we woke up on January 1st of not 2020, of 2000.
2000. Yes.
And then
Yep.
we all woke up, and it's when you described that. I mean, I was pregnant with Grant at the time, and I remember it's like everything was the same. And I think back to intentional pivots and perfecting the pivots and being intentional. It isn't a December, nobody, you got to take charge of your own, and change is what you make it and what you put into it. So having a calendar flip a day isn't going to do anything unless people intentionally, and let's hope that we start making as a group, as a democracy, we find ways to make pivots on what has happened and make some really big changes for the better.
Kudos to that. Rah, rah. Okay, let's close on that note.
All right,
Good
Amy,
job,
until
Sandy.
next
Thank
week.
you. All right,
Bye-bye.
have a good day. Bye.